sense when you think about some of the other things, because that small exodus would have probably happened after the time of the Pharaoh Akhenaten, wouldn't it have? Akhenaten and Nefertiti?
Yes, well after.
Okay, so that would have given them at least a little bit of a basis to start moving towards a monotheism, because Egypt during Akhenaten would have had, or went from the old gods to worshiping the sun god Aten, getting rid of all of the old gods, and maybe some of these Egyptians that moved forward had that in their repertoire and mixed it in with some of the Canaanite mythology.
It could well. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting little indicators. I mean, Moses is an Egyptian name. Circumcision is an Egyptian practice. The Levites themselves are a unique tribe in that they were never allocated lands or towns or anything. Okay. They didn't get property. They seem to have formed basically a floating stratum on top of the native Canaanites. And they said, okay, we're not going to work. We don't like working. We will communicate with God. Excellent. Now, how can we earn money? You guys, sacrifices. Perfect. That's a cynical way of looking at it, but it's one way.
Yeah, and it's one that does fit with the evidence that we have now too, that pretty well, and that's something I hadn't really thought about until we started talking about it. So a little bit more about David and Solomon. Now, the way that the Bible, or at least the stories in, I know that there's two separate sets of stories, Samuel and Kings, and a little bit in Chronicles, but it seems like that some of the stories, he seems to be like a really nice guy or a really good guy and a hero, and then if you look at another part of it, he's more like a bandit king or a brigand. Which one do you think is the correct term, I guess, is the correct way to look at him?
Right. I have a lot of difficulty liking David. I know he's a great hero and a shining star. He's probably the second most important personality in the Bible outside of Moses. But, geez, he does some bad things. He's very unlikable in a lot of ways. He's very charismatic. I would say that he'd fit much more on the, what would you call him, a charming schemer?
Okay.
I would put him into that category, assuming that the stories are correct. I mean, if the modern archaeology is correct, then he ruled a tiny, tiny little kingdom, no big city, no great empire, but somehow he's become the founding hero of the entire nation.
Now, that is true. Now, what about Solomon? Because, I mean, the stories that we think of when we think of Solomon, we think of this super rich, super wise king that covered this vast swath of land. Does that really flesh out with what the archaeology shows us there as well? Or is that another little bit of where it's kind of history written by the victors?
We have almost no archaeology, actually, for the time of David and Solomon. This is one of the debates. It's about dating buildings and edifices. A lot of the things which have been previously attributed to Solomon in various cities are now being redated to a century after his time, because we're fairly sure of the dating of Solomon, and he died in about either 931 or 927 BC. That's fairly certain. But the buildings he's supposed to have built, which were formerly considered to be evidence for his greatness, now modern archaeologists are saying, no, they didn't exist. Solomon didn't build them. They were built by a completely separate king a century later. Now, the Bible certainly hypes Solomon to the max, doesn't it?
Oh, it does.
Oh, he's the king. Yeah, he's the king of bling. He's amazing. But even the Bible itself doesn't quite buy that, because at times the Bible says, for example, that in his later years, this man who's ruling a vast empire is annoyed by, Rezin of Damascus and the king of Moab. And they were tiny, piddly little fly specks of kingdoms. And yet there's this great king ruling vast lands is annoyed by mosquitoes and gnats. And you're going, well, there's something wrong there. And Solomon is portrayed as the wisest of kings, someone that you just fall down at his, he'd be a star on sale of the century, or let's make a deal or something. But then the minute he dies, the whole kingdom just falls apart. It just completely collapses. Now, if the guy was so great at being a ruler, how come everything just fell apart? So Solomon, and Solomon in the Bible too, you really don't get a sense of the personality there. David, you certainly see the person, and you see his actions, and he talks a lot. A lot of the narrative actually has his quoted speech. Solomon, it's like he's sitting up in an imperial throne behind a thick veil. And you're not really sure what's going on in his head, or even if you're allowed to part the veil and see him. So Solomon's another bit dodgy one.
Okay. Now, along with the ideas of the founding of Israel, one thing that's always kind of struck me is the whole two kingdoms, and then in Solomon's reign, or at least David's reign, he seems to unite them. Or was it even Saul that was considered the one that united them? I kind of get those three confused in that.
It's unclear. If one reconstruction of the history is that Saul ruled a group of people in the north, who later became the kingdom of Israel. David's power base was in the south. The Bible depicts David as Saul's successor, but he could have been a completely independent rival, and he managed to unite the 10 northern tribes very briefly. But the union is so precarious. They were only united under the reigns of really David and Solomon. Saul doesn't really go south into the territory of Judah, the tribe of Judah, at all, really. He stays in the north. So it's unclear if Saul ruled anything more than the 10 northern tribes. And then supposedly David and Solomon unite them. But as I said, the whole thing falls apart. It's just such a precarious unity. And to me it all says this is not a united people who are sundered. This is a group of tribes who were forcibly whacked together by maybe Saul, maybe David. And then when they died, they just fell back to their natural divisions. It's sort of like, it'd be like, say, Yugoslavia. The Croats and the Serbs, etc., they don't really get along. But they were briefly united under a strong man, General Tito. But as soon as he died, bloop, they just fell apart.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that does seem to make some sense. So as far as some of the stories that you've that are stories and some of the things from the Bible, what are some of the things that have stood out to you the most? I mean, as far as in the histories and the cultures.
Reading the Bible, I have been struck by its misogyny. I hate to call it, but it is. It just seems misogyny. The number of times, and this is a classic example, every time I come across yet another reference to a prostitute, I want to pull my hair out. So many stories seem to have prostitutes in them, but there's no reason for them to be a prostitute in the story. It's just like... It's like whenever the Bible needs to talk about a single woman, she's got to be a prostitute. And you're thinking, no, don't. Now, they're often portrayed very, very positively, but still, why give them this role all the time? Just drives me nuts.
Well, if you think about it, the way the prostitutes are now, though, if you try to draw like a comparison, if they're like a madam, then they can wield quite a bit of power, though, because I mean they do have basically a lot of the dirt on some of the leaders of the time, so that may be something that the Bible may be alluding to as well.
Yeah, that's a possibility. Actually, I mean, the Bible does portray quite a lot of women as strong women. The wives of the patriarchs were particularly good at scheming to get their sons where they wanted them to go. And certainly they're held up as heroines in Jewish culture. Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah, but you are right about the misogyny in a lot of it. I mean, because a lot of the rules of the laws of the Old Testament when it comes to women are just downright horrible. I mean, I have yet to see, and from my understanding of studying, some of that is actually better than some of the other rules of law in the area at the time, which really frightens me.
Yes. And one thing I was interested to learn was that the idea that a woman has to be covered goes right back to the ancient Assyrians. I was looking at one of their law codes, and it's quite clear. It says women must be covered if they're out and about. So that's not an Islamic or a Jewish or an Arabic thing. That's deeply embedded in the history of the Middle East, in a people which had nothing to do with the Jews or the Arabs, with the Assyrians. So I thought that's an interesting fact. So it goes through the whole Middle East and probably the Babylonians too. If you were a woman, you had to go out covered.
Yeah. Now, another thing, it seems like it gets glossed over a lot of times, but it seems like Yahweh and the Israelites really were a very racist bunch. I mean, because they just really did not like anybody else.
No, they don't seem to have had good relations with anyone, do they? I mean, I suppose we don't really know about the other kingdoms around them. What are there's Ammon, Moab, Edom. We don't have any literature from those places saying, oh, we have a few monuments. I think you could say it's just it's perhaps not an Israelite characteristic. It's a characteristic quite probably of all the little piddly kingdoms. They just didn't like each other, and they're always out on the make, conducting raids into their neighbours, boasting about slaughtering their kings. There's a famous stele, the Moabite stele, where the king of Moab boasts about crushing Israel and destroying this and flaying this. So I think they all hated each other.
Yeah,
it was just. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like genocide seems to be a pretty popular topic in the Bible too, at least in the Old Testament.
Oh, reading Joshua is very, very distressing, I find. Joshua simply talks about the divinely mandated genocide of the native Canaanites. And passage after passage after passage, we came and we took this city and we killed everyone. We killed everyone, men and women and children. Isn't that great? And you're just face-palming going, oh, no. Yeah. So genocide, certainly in Joshua. Now, that's proved a tremendous theological problem, certainly after the Holocaust. I mean, prior to the Second World War, I think you would have found that the attitude to the genocides in Joshua were portrayed as God's rightful holy vengeance or rightful holy will. And they were just great. And everyone would have believed this. Europeans, Jews, etc. It was just part of the deal. Then the Holocaust happened, and it turned the book of Joshua, into a moral morass. So today people are very ambivalent about it.
Well, I don't know. No. I know of a few apologists here in the United States that tend to use that divine slaughter analogy or defense, that they deserved it because God said so, or even because the whole town or whatever was just so wicked that they needed to be put out of their misery. That's still a very popular idea here in the U.S.
I suppose it's the only rationalization you can make for it. I mean, I find that, it'd be common here too. But I just find that horrific. It's just,
Yeah, fortunately, you don't find a whole lot of sermons preached on Joshua. That's something that they don't. They tend to gloss over that a little bit.
I think it's something that you should avoid. Yeah, but I have read those apologetics, and I just want to scream at the screen when I see them, and I think, well, you are therefore defining any divine action as good by definition, but that in effect, but you are then saying that whatever God does is good. And to me, that removes the entire moral content from the word good. If you're just saying it's what God does and wants, there is no independent notion of good or goodness outside of God. So he's got carte blanche to do anything. I just find that morally questionable.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, we're used to this. In more modern times, we have this more post-Hellenistic idea of God as being this good. When we think of God of the Bible, we think of this good thing, but we don't realize that back in the time of the Israelites and even before that, when you were discussing the gods, you didn't want the attention of the gods. I mean, they were just seen as these raw forces of nature that you did not want to draw their attention. You were afraid of them. they weren't a moral
exactly.